In this video, I'm going to talk about this large 17-inch gaming laptop from MSI, the Vector GP78HX. It is meant to be a desktop replacement, and it is very similar to their Raider model that I reviewed a few months back, but the Vector here comes with a few features less, it's a bit more stealthy, and it is slightly more affordable. Which doesn't mean that it is cheap, because it does come with some pretty powerful hardware. Now, this particular model right here has an Intel Core i9-13980HX processor, 175-watt RTX 4080 graphics card, 32 GB of DDR5 memory, and a 240Hz IPS panel with 2560 by 1600p resolution. So let's see how it performs, what kind of features it offers, and if this is the gaming laptop you should get. Let's begin. The MSI Vector is a very chunky 17-inch gaming laptop. It weighs a bit over 3 kilos, and then even more so if you add the large 330-watt charger it comes with. I do think MSI needs to consider using more compact chargers, which do exist even for this wattage. But even if they did that, this would still very clearly be an alternative for a desktop PC when, for some reason or another, a desktop PC is just not an option. Visually, it basically has the same frame as the MSI Raider GE78HX with some small differences. And I don't really think there is anything wrong with reusing the same tooling for different models, especially when it is a good design that is built well with strong hinges and barely any flex. It just feels very sturdy. It also has the same SteelSeries tactile keyboard that I personally really like, and it has the same glass touchpad that isn't amazing, but it holds up all right compared to most other gaming laptops. But there are two noticeable cost savings. The RGB bar in the front is gone, which is a good way to save money, and they removed the top-facing speakers that were next to the motherboard, which does affect the sound quite a bit. Now, if you use a headset with your laptop, you will be completely fine, but if you frequently use your laptop speakers, you might want to consider the Raider, for example, that does sound really good, or go for any other laptop that has better speakers. These are just not that great. The connections remain the same. You get a Type-C port with Thunderbolt support, a full-size SD card reader, and a combined audio jack on the left side. On the back, there's the power connector, a Type-C connection with DisplayPort support, HDMI 2.1 and an Ethernet connection, and on the right side there's two Type-A ports and another Type-C port, and this one can also be used for USB charging, which is actually really great if you do need to take it somewhere for some light work and leave that huge and heavy 330-watt charger at home. Just don't expect to game with a USB charger. Now, I personally would have liked if they moved at least one Type-A connection to the back, because if you use a wired mouse, the connection and its cable will be in the way of your mouse while gaming, which can be very annoying. Now, there are quite a few different configurations that you can choose from, but as I said at the start, this one comes with a 175-watt RTX 4080 graphics card, the i9-13980HX processor, 32 GB of DDR5 memory, and a 2 TB NVMe SSD. It also has the 2560 by 1600p 240Hz panel, though some cheaper Vectors will come with a 1920 by 1200p 165Hz panel instead, which is not something I would recommend if you go for an i9 and an RTX 4080 combo. Now, the 13980HX processor has 8 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores with a total of 32 threads. That is 8 E-cores more than the 12900HX that was in the GE67HX I tested last year, and compared to the 13950HX that was in the Raider, it just runs at slightly higher clock speeds. In Cinebench R23, that results in a score of over 32,000, beating the Raider by about 4% and beating anything older by a huge margin. If you look at a Blender render, these new i9s are a big upgrade compared to the older CPUs. It's about 3 times faster than the 3-year-old i9-10980HK, for example, and even compared to the last gen i9-12900HX, it is a big jump forward. This laptop uses a 2560 by 1600 pixel panel, so it has more vertical pixels than a regular Quad HD panel has, and you really want to run games at this 1600p resolution because 1080p on a 1600p panel just doesn't look that great. Now, most of the games I tested for this video ran with no issues on 1600p native. Light games like Doom Eternal and Counter-Strike 2 made very good use of that 240Hz panel, and AAA titles like Cyberpunk 2077, God of War, Baldur's Gate 3, and Spider-Man ran in the 90 to 160 FPS range, and only Starfield ended up a bit too close to that 60 FPS line. But keep in mind, Starfield is very rough on most systems right now, so when we enable FSR2, we got a comfortable 81 FPS instead, with 1% lows at 60 FPS, which gives you a much better experience than without upscaling. Now, since this is an RTX GPU, you do get benefits of ray tracing and DLSS as well. And if we look at Dying Light 2 and Spider-Man, for example, and instead of running native 1600p, we enable ray tracing, set the DLSS on quality mode, and turn on frame generation, it will look better and it will still give you a smooth experience. So you have options that you can explore until you find what fits your preference and your game style best. And if you want to play Cyberpunk 2.0 and Phantom Liberty with full path tracing, you can set DLSS to balanced, turn frame generation and ray reconstruction on, and you'll get just over 80 FPS average and 60 FPS 1% lows, which is quite great for a heavy title like Cyberpunk. The 1600 pixel display on these high-end vectors is also very good, and its color performance is excellent actually. It has a pretty wide gamut covering the entire sRGB spectrum and 98% of the P3 spectrum, and it actually outperforms the Raider in that regard, but I'm not sure if this is because this particular sample is just slightly better or if the whole latest batch of 1600p 240Hz panels is just better overall. It also comes with multiple color profiles which are calibrated pretty well. The default P3 profile is close to perfect, but it just overshoots a bit with blue, something the Raider didn't do. Still, it is a very good panel to use for content creation directly out of the box, and if you really need that perfect color accuracy, the color gamut is wide enough to allow you to calibrate it for sRGB and P3 perfectly. It is an IPS panel, so contrast was not exceptional, falling slightly below the Raider this time around. It does get really bright, reaching almost 500 nits, which makes it pretty okay if you use it in a very bright environment or even outside. But it also dims nicely with a minimum white level of 25 nits, so it is great for those of you that like to game in very dark rooms as well. In terms of speed, we measured 9.2 milliseconds of total latency, which means it did beat the others in the graph, including the Raider, which for some reason was consistently 5 milliseconds behind. The response times were reasonable. It is not OLED instant, and even with the default overdrive setting turned on, many transitions were just not fast enough for this to be considered a real 240Hz panel. Some transitions are in the 1 to 2 millisecond range, some are in the 9 to 11 millisecond range, but most sit around 5 milliseconds, which is just slower than a 240Hz display should be. There's some overshoot going on, but it's not that noticeable in actual use, so it is an okay panel in terms of speed, and it is definitely better than entry-level panels that are often a lot slower. But if you can find a 240Hz OLED at a similar price point, that is definitely the way to go. The 2TB SSD in this model comes from Samsung, and it performs just fine in the PCMark Trace benchmarks. It does outperform the 4TB RAID configuration from the Raider, which yet again proves that RAID doesn't really make sense in laptops like these. The Vector has a 90 watt-hour battery, which is a slight cut down from the 99 watt-hour battery that is in the Raider, but it is still on the larger side overall. In the modern office benchmark, which simulates a light use of the laptop, it ran out of battery in 4 hours and 45 minutes, while the Raider lasted 6.5 hours. Now, both laptops were set to their super battery mode, with the panel fixed at 180 nits of brightness, so the Vector is definitely using a bit more power somewhere else. Now, I don't expect most people to run these big laptops on a battery very often, but it is still nice to have the option to do so. And of course, you shouldn't expect to game on a battery, because if you use the dedicated GPU, the battery will go from full to empty in about an hour and a half. The webcam is pretty bad for a machine with this price tag. It will be fine enough for occasional use if you have good lighting, but that's really as far as it goes. I really do like the physical privacy slider that they added, but the quality of the actual webcam should be better in my opinion. Now, in terms of thermals and noise, most laptops with these specs will run warm and loud during gaming. In its extreme mode, I measured 56 decibels from a 50 centimeter distance, which is quite a lot. Now, it does make sense, because if you're running a heavy game like Cyberpunk, for example, this laptop has to deal with close to 70 watts of power from the CPU and about 160 watts of power from the GPU. So it cannot really afford to run the fans much slower than this. And it did manage to just keep the temperatures under control, so you cannot really slow the fans down without reducing the CPU or GPU power. On most MSI laptops, the balance profile usually feels like the most reasonable option, but on the Vector here, it still stays pretty loud. CPU power does go down a bit, and the thermals do look better overall, but it is still so loud. I mean, anything that gets near 50 decibels will require you to use proper headphones if you want to game comfortably. And even the silent profile remains very loud, coming in at 48 decibels. So yeah, it is using more power than most RTX 4070 laptops in their fastest mode, and thermals do look okay, but it is very, very far from what I would call quiet. Now, the super battery mode is the only one that actually keeps the Vector quiet in gaming, but it does reduce CPU and GPU power by so much that you lose a lot of your performance. So you can easily keep it quiet for light gaming, but if you want to really use the hardware that you just spent a lot of your money on, you will want to also use a headset. And I do think that's a bit disappointing, because the Raider has similar specs and similar power levels, and it did manage to offer a proper balanced thermal profile with reasonable noise levels. So this was clearly by design. Now, when it comes to software, MSI's package really works well, but there are still some things that can be improved. There is a separate app for display color profiles. There's the SteelSeries app for the RGB effects of the keyboard. There is a completely separate app for the sound. And then there is the main software for the fan profiles and other hardware features. And keep in mind, all of them work really well, but I think it's pretty messy to have so many apps apart instead of putting them all in one nicely compact software package. Also, MSI really needs to stop having data collection on by default without asking for permission. Now, to disable it, you need to go into the settings menu, and then when you try to disable it, it still gives you this pop-up to confirm if you really want it off. Now, I am pretty sure that there are some legal rules here in the EU about data collection like this, and I did mention it many times before, but it is still there, and you will have to manually turn it off. It is not hard to open the Vector up, but the bottom panel is held by very small plastic clips that can easily break, so you have to be very careful here. And inside, you can easily clean the fans, you can replace the battery, you can replace the SSD or add a second one. Memory is not soldered, and you can replace the Wi-Fi chip, even though it is Wi-Fi 6, so you don't really need to do that just yet. So overall, the main downsides of the Vector here are the poor webcam, mediocre speakers, and the tuning of performance profiles. You get 3 profiles that offer a variation of very loud and fast, and one that is quiet but a lot slower. There's nothing in between. And I do think that there needs to be a properly balanced profile, which is something that MSI can easily fix with a simple software update. The size and weight of this thing are things that you need to consider based on your own personal use, because this is a desktop replacement. It is big, it is very heavy, and it has a large charger. So if you need something that is more portable and that you want to drag around with you every single day, this is not the machine for you. Just like I said with the Raider, most of what the MSI Vector offers is actually quite good. It is sturdy, the keyboard is pleasant, you get a lot of useful connections, you get USB charging, the 1600p display is quite nice, and most of all, you get a lot of CPU and gaming performance. Just remember that the cheaper Vector models will have the 1200p display that will perform differently, so I would go for the 1600 pixel one instead. So if you're considering a Vector because you need a desktop replacement, I really think it can make sense if the price is right. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. Now, since this is basically a cut-down Raider, it also needs to be significantly cheaper in order to make sense. Here in the Netherlands, for example, this top spec Vector costs 3,400 euros and the similar Raider costs 3,600 euros. So for 200 euros more, you get an RGB bar, better speakers, better tuned performance profiles, and a much better battery life. And if you're already ready to spend more than 3,000 euros on a laptop, spending 200 more on all those things is not that excessive. In the US, however, I actually cannot find any listings for the Vector just yet, but the Raider with similar specs will cost you $2,600, and I really doubt that Vector will be much cheaper. But in some other regions, the Vector might be much cheaper, so as always, the prices will vary so much depending on where you live and what day of the week it is, and it is very important to just keep your eye on the actual prices in your region before making a decision. That's it. Now that is all I had for today, but before I go, let's hear it from the sponsor of this video. This video is brought to you by Corsair and their Virtuoso Pro gaming headset. With its open back design and 50mm graphene drivers, it offers an excellent sound quality in games, movies, as well as music. It is very light and extremely comfortable, and you can easily adjust it to very small as well as very large heads. You can also easily replace the cables, ear pads, headband, and covers, making repairs and maintenance easier than ever. Check them out using the links in the description below. Thank you all for watching. I hope this video was helpful enough. If you liked it, do consider clicking that subscribe button so you never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!